Can you picture if the people who were chosen by a greater power to lead a group of people ended up ruining their lives? Let's figure out what happened with the rise and fall of 4 kings of Israel and Judah, whose reigns were marked by chaos and luxury, which was the exact opposite of what God wanted. What makes a king stray so far that his country is about to fall apart after being chosen on promises from God to lead and protect it? How much can the abuse of power change the course of a whole country's history? We will look into these plots by looking at both the choices these kings and queens made and how those choices have affected history. The stories of these rulers take place during a time when Israel was doing very well, thanks to the guidance of famous figures like David and Solomon. But when they were replaced by less moral people, a time of moral and spiritual decline began. One good example is Jeroboam I. At first, he did a good job as Solomon's administrator, but later, his desire for independence caused him to split the country and start an idolatrous group to keep his power. This choice not only broke up a country, but it also put Israel's moral unity at risk. Others, like Ahaz and Manasseh, went in the same direction, each contributing to more sin and unfairness. Ahaz started doing things that were against God's rules, and Manasseh, who was probably the most famous of them, filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, going in a very different direction from what their ancestors had taught them. These stories show how destructive it is to have unchecked desire and to give up on moral and religious beliefs. As we learn more about each rule, a scary trend starts to show itself. If you don't follow God's instructions, you will ruin yourself and your country. When we think about these stories, they make us wonder how long power can last when it doesn't have morals or spiritual ties. Leaders of all times should learn from the sad stories of these kings, whose reigns were marked by terrible mistakes. If you don't have a real respect for duty and God, power will lead to your downfall. How do you think these old stories affect how we think about morals and leadership today? Feel free to leave your ideas in the section below and come along with us as we read through the Bible stories. Before we continue to learn about these interesting kings' lives, please give the movie a like if you think it's interesting. It really helps us and makes us want to give you more stuff like this. Also, please subscribe to our channel for more deep and life-changing findings. Also, if you want to help with this job, please leave a super thanks. We can share more Bible stories and spread this message of faith and hope thanks to your gift. Thank you for your help. As the story of this amazing event is told again, let's learn more about what Jeroboam left behind. When Jeroboam took the throne during a time of chaos, he had to deal with both government problems and the huge job of keeping his people loyal to the God of Israel. His choices, on the other hand, would show a path marked by fear and desire, setting off a chain of events that would have effects that would last for generations. In addition to a country, Jeroboam was given the duty to rule in line with God's law. But he had to make a choice that would completely change the course of the northern kingdom because he didn't want to lose power over his people, who could still go to Jerusalem to pray. By building worship centers in Bethel and Dan, Jeroboam not only took his people's attention away from the main worship center in Jerusalem, but he also brought back the worship of the golden calf, which was one of Israel's worst sins. Even though this choice was smart from a political point of view, it was terrible for my soul. Jeroboam's decision to make a pagan cult a state policy drove him away from the true worship of Yahweh and put the moral and spiritual purity of the whole kingdom at risk. The term Jeroboam's sins was used many times in the Bible to describe Israel's later turn away from God, showing how important his decisions were. Jeroboam broke a rule set by God since the time of the Exodus, when he chose priests who were not Levites. This break not only took away some of the Levitical priests' spiritual power, but it also led to bad behavior and lessened the power of true prayer. As religious strictness fell apart, so did social justice and morals, which were important for keeping Israelite society together and making sure everyone was healthy. There were times in Jeroboam's life when God warned him not to do something, like when the man of God from Judah prophesied against the altar at Bethel. This whole thing, which ended with Jeroboam's hand being temporarily paralyzed and then being fixed by the prophet's prayers, should have been a clear warning. But the fact that he keeps up his egotistical policy shows that he doesn't want to admit he's wrong and change direction. As a king who led Israel astray, Jeroboam's history is a somber warning of how dangerous it is for leaders to put practical goals ahead of holy principles. His story makes us think about how strong leaders' choices are and how they have spiritual and social effects that last a long time. It is interesting to look at how power, faith, and morals interact in the life of Jeroboam I, because he made choices that hurt the kingdom's devotion to its God. This story tells us that no matter what, choices made out of fear, ambition, or what's best for politics can ruin not only a leader, but also a whole country. By leading Israel away from true prayer, Jeroboam set up a pattern of rebellion that had terrible results. This pattern of adultery was carried on by Ahab, who took the throne about 50 years after Jeroboam. Ahab not only kept up the bad habits of his father, but his wife Jezebel, who was a devoted follower of Baal, made them even worse. When Ahab married Jezebel, things took a big turn for the worse in Israel's spiritual past. Her father was the king of the Ides, and her mother was Jezebel. She brought her heathen religion with her and was determined to bring it to Israel. A temple to Baal was built in Samaria, and Yahweh's preachers were persecuted all the time. This shows how dangerous her impact was. Ahab's willingness to let worship grow and Jezebel's push for action made it possible for it to happen, which hurt the moral and spiritual fabric of the country. During Ahab's rule, one of the most exciting events in the Bible took place. Elijah and the followers of Baal fought on Mount Carmel. This event not only showed how powerful God was, but it also set the stage for the spiritual battle that was going on in the heart of Israel. Even though God's power was clearly shown when holy fire burned up Elijah's offering, making the prophets of Baal look bad and powerless, Ahab stayed loyal to Jezebel and Baal. Even when clear wonders are shown, Ahab wouldn't change his mind. This shows that he was deeply spiritually evil. Sua's incapacity to repent after the Mount of Carmelo shows that the northern kingdom had turned away from God at that point. This stubbornness shows not only flaws in individual character, but also the effects of leaders who constantly chose to go against what God said was right. In addition to leaving the faith, Ahab's rule was marked by greed and unfairness, as the story of Naboth's farm shows. This story, in which Ahab, unable to legally get Naboth's farm, lets Jezebel make a plan that leads to Naboth's unjust execution, shows how seriously worship could hurt people's morals. Ahab's and Jezebel's actions not only had an effect on their own age, but they also set the northern kingdom on a path of decline that would end in destruction. Leaders like Ahab allowed and encouraged God worship, which led to more and more bad behavior and cut the people off from God's protection and benefit. The story of Ahab and Jezebel is a sad warning of what happens when leaders make bad decisions. As we think about these kings and the choices they made, we are reminded of how important it is to have leaders who care about fairness, honesty, and sticking to moral and spiritual ideals. The lesson of his country has been passed down through the years, showing that both leaders and people need to be careful and honest. Not only does the sad story of Ahab and Naboth's farm show how cruel his country was, but it also shows how deeply corrupt his rule was. Ahab's desire for a vineyard next to his house shows that he has no respect for God's rule or the basic rights of his people. By refusing to sell his property, Naboth was not only following the law of Moses, but also defending a holy principle of family identity and permanence that Ahab was ready to break to get what he wanted. When Ahab's offers were turned down, He gave in to sadness and anger, which let Jezebel do one of the worst things he did during his reign. She used a devilish plan to trick the power structures into wrongly accusing Naboth of blasphemy, which led to his death by burning. This horrible act not only proved that Ahab was right to take the farm, but it also showed how badly things were going morally and spiritually under his guidance. In the wicked vineyard, Elijah's scolding of Ahab is one of the most famous scenes in the Bible because it shows how God will always respond to wrongdoing. Elijah's vision not only predicted the sad deaths of Ahab and Jezebel, but it also predicted the end of their lineage, which meant the end of a clearly evil time. Surprisingly, Ahab's response to the fight with Elijah was something no one expected. He temporarily changed his mind, tore his clothes, and fasted. Though he couldn't change what happened because of what he did, he at least showed some signs that he knew he was bad. While this change of heart slowed down God's judgment, it did not stop it. This shows that genuine regret can lessen the effects of our choices, but it does not always erase them. Moving forward in time, Manasseh takes the throne of Judah about 100 years after Ahab. He undoes the religious changes made by his father Hezekiah in astonishing ways. Manasseh, whose name sounds a lot like the word apostasy, didn't just serve foreign gods. He publicly disobeyed God by bringing pagan worship into the temple in Jerusalem. Outside of the temple's holy areas, there were altars to the heavenly hosts. This was against the first commandment and an attempt to mix Canaanite and Babylonian beliefs with the cult of Yahweh. The people of Judah were confused by that act of profanity, and it also tainted the faith that the temple was meant to protect. The story of Manasseh, like the story of Ahab, is a sad warning of how bad it is when leaders are dishonest. These two kings not only did not do what they were supposed to do for God and their people, but they also led their countries to spiritual and social ruin. This part of the story is meant to show how leaders' decisions affect not only their own time, but also future generations, leaving behind a legacy that can be both bad and good. When we think about these kings, it makes us think about the duty that comes with being powerful and how important it is for leaders to be honest and trustworthy. Manasseh's disrespect for the temple was not only a breach of holy space, but it also revealed a deep spiritual weakness in Judah. The temple in Jerusalem was a real sign of God's presence among his people, but it was ruined by actions that went against everything it stood for. That action of anger had huge effects, changing Judah's faith and national character. Manasseh's worst crime was giving up his own son as an offering. One of the main reasons the Canaanites were driven out by Israel hundreds of years ago was because they did this horrible thing which God hated. By using this cruel rite, Manasseh not only disrespected human life, but he also publicly disobeyed God's command to value each person as a unique creation. When Manasseh brought back child sacrifice and made it a legal practice, it was the worst kind of moral and spiritual decline. Not only did that action show worship of a god, but it also went against society's core values and was very different from God's ways. In addition to sacrificing people, Manasseh also practiced astrology, clairvoyance, and necromancy, which are all forms of God worship. Such actions, which are clearly banned by Mosaic law, show that people don't believe in God's authority at all. By looking for power and knowledge in occult and evil places, Manasseh not only polluted his own soul, but he also let bad spiritual forces spread throughout the land. Doing these things was an attempt to take over God's job as the best teacher and source of understanding and knowledge. Every meeting with spiritualists and psychics was against the law and hurt the trusting connection between God and his people that should exist between them. Manasseh's rule, in which many people rejected holy ideals, had effects that went beyond his own life. The Bible directly blames Israel for Judah's final exile, which was a heavenly judgment for the permanent wrongdoing it caused. Through the prophets, God not only spoke against Manasseh, but also warned of a major cleaning up of Jerusalem that would be similar to how he destroyed the homes of Jeroboam and Ahab. Interestingly, the holy books talk about Manasseh's late repentance. They say that after being captured by the Assyrians, he was shamed before God and started doing some good religious things again. Even though they truly felt sorry for what they did, their repentance wasn't enough to fix the problems caused by their years of worshipping idols. The revival was only on the surface. It didn't get rid of the pagan practices that had become deeply ingrained in Judah's religion and society. We don't learn from the story of Manasseh how much power leaders have over the moral and spiritual direction of a country. It shows how a leader's choices can have disastrous results for both himself and the people he leads. Manasseh tells us of how important it is to have leaders who care about and work for justice, truth, and holiness, knowing that they are responsible to both God and the people they rule. Even though Manasseh was in charge, his rule ended on a happy note that showed God's kindness and patience. The fact that Manasseh was captured and sent away was both a penalty and a chance for him to grow spiritually, which he did, and which changed his relationship with God. The time he spent in prison in Babylon caused Manasseh to change drastically. The king's pride was hurt by being caught, trapped, and jailed in a foreign country. In this very sad moment, Manasseh turned to the God of his ancestors. He begged for forgiveness, and by some miracle, he was put back on his throne in Jerusalem. This amazing event not only brought back his kingdom, but it also renewed his faith in the real God and his spirit. When Manasseh got back to Jerusalem, he started making changes to fix the problems that his previous rule had caused. He took down the idols and heathen shrines that he had put up, even in the holy temple. This made it possible for people to worship Yahweh again. These acts of regret and repair showed that he truly felt sorry for what he did and wanted to make things right between him and God. But the effects of his decades of worshipping idols were too much for him to handle. Even though he tried to change things, customs and idolatries were deeply ingrained in Judah's society. People kept making sacrifices on old pagan shrines, even when they were praying to Yahweh. This showed how hard it was to get rid of all the spiritual and cultural factors that were set up during his previous rule. People should remember from Manasseh's story that a leader's actions can have effects that last a long time after he or she is gone. Even though he tried to fix things, the choices he made in the beginning still had an impact on Judah, and in the end, they led to their exile in Babylon. The path of Manasseh teaches us important lessons about what leaders are responsible for and how much power they have. It also shows that people can be forgiven, even if they have done bad things in the past. A leader has a huge impact on the group, for better or worse. And Manasseh is both of those things. He is an example. His life shows how important it is to be honest, humble, and follow moral and spiritual rules. He also says that more than just surface changes are needed for real change to happen. It needs a change in both hearts and cultures. With its emotional ups and downs, Manasseh's story shows how hard it is to ask for forgiveness and make things right. His rule makes us think about how our choices affect others and how God's forgiveness can save even the most lost. The story of Manasseh shows how seriously God takes worshipping false gods and witchcraft. The effects of what he did were so bad that even his later confession of sin could not undo all the damage he did to the spiritual life of Judah. Manasseh's rule left an enduring mark. It set up a pattern of apostasy that, despite some changes, led to Judah's fall and its following exile in Babylon. Although Manasseh was very bad, his story shows how much God's love is sufficient. The fact that even the worst criminals can be saved is a strong reminder of how merciful God is. However, history also shows a sad truth. Forgiveness is possible, but the physical and mental effects of the choices we make may still be there. The story of Ahaz that comes next is very different from any chance of redemption that Manasseh might have given at the end of his life. When Ahaz takes the throne, things are very unstable in Judah. There are enemies from outside the country and a faith problem within the country. Ahaz, who was in danger from both the northern kingdom and Syria, shows how dangerous it is for leaders to be filled with fear and doubt. During his rule, he makes a lot of bad choices that never keep Judah safe and even threaten its spiritual purity. Following the horrible ways of the peoples that God drove away, he sacrificed his own son, which adds to the sad irony of his leadership. In order to feel safe, Ahaz forms partnerships with other countries like Syria. This was a usual way to play politics in the past, but the prophets say it shows that Ahaz trusts people more than God. This desperate move not only hurts Judah officially, but it also opens it up to pagan influences, which speeds up the spiritual decline that Manasseh started. The meeting between Ahaz and Isaiah is a turning point that shows how bad the king's faith problem really is. Even though God promised through the messenger, Ahaz doesn't want to look for or accept a heavenly sign. Instead, he chooses to go in a more practical direction. This choice shows that he doesn't believe in God's safety or the future of his country or, more generally, the whole kingdom. The things that Ahaz and Manasseh did have long-lasting effects. He couldn't keep Judah rooted in its traditional religion, and he relied on partnerships with other countries, which led to disasters like the destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile. Under his rule, Judah stops being a shining example of righteousness and truth and falls into the same level of corruption as the evil nations around it. The sad story of Ahaz shows us that choices made in times of trouble can determine the future of a country. It shows in a powerful way what happens when leaders put fear and self-preservation ahead of faith and relying on God. This story makes us think about more than just the instant traits we want in our leaders. It makes us think about the spiritual and moral effects of their decisions as well. When we look back at the lives of Jeroboam, Ahab, Manasseh, and Ahaz, the four kings who had a big impact on Israel and Judah's history, we see a rich fabric of mistakes, redemptions, and lessons that will last for a long time. Each shows in its own way how power, faith, and duty all work together in complicated ways. Jeroboam broke up a country and led a group of people away from their faith. He set a pattern of disobedience that would last for generations by bringing in new worship places and gods. The story of Jeroboam shows us how risky it is to be ambitious and not follow God's rules. It also shows how a leader's choices can lead to a long circle of lying and spiritual ruin. Because Jezebel controlled Ahab, Israel fell away from God and morality. During his rule, there was God worship and unfair treatment of people. Things like the battle on Mount Carmel, which showed God's patience and power to correct, came to a head. The story of Ahab shows us how leaders can be swayed by bad factors, which can put justice and truth at risk. Manasseh, who was probably the saddest of the kings, shows how people can be saved. After an evil rule at first, his time in Babylon was a turning point that caused him to turn away from his sins and partially restore his kingdom and faith. No matter how bad things have gotten, Manasseh shows that recovery is possible. But his story is also a warning about how some actions have effects that can't be undone and last long after the person is healed. Achaz's lack of faith in times of trouble led to bad partnerships. This shows how dangerous it is for leaders to act out of fear instead of faith. His choices, especially his acceptance of pagan practices and his ties with Assyria, put both Judah's political freedom and its spiritual identity at risk. Ahaz shows how fear can make people lose faith in set values, which can lead to choices that make problems worse instead of lessening them. It's clear from studying these four kings that being a leader takes more than just being good at politics. It calls for morals that are based on strong spiritual beliefs. The stories of Jeroboam, Ahab, Manasseh, and Ahaz are not just facts. They are also lessons and warnings about how leadership can affect people. They show us that choices made by powerful people can have long-lasting effects that change the course of whole countries. As we think about these stories, we should ask ourselves how our deeds and leadership show what we value. The lessons of these kings are both useful and depressing at a time when power often doesn't seem to matter when it comes to morals. May we learn from their mistakes and strive to be leaders who always choose faith, justice, and honesty, no matter what role they play. This ends our look at the reigns and effects of some of the most infamous leaders in biblical history. May the lessons we learn from their lives not only make us think, but also make us act in a way that leaves a legacy of loyalty and virtue. We hope that our look at the lives of these ancient kings taught you something useful. If you liked this video and want to see more interesting stories like this, please like our page, subscribe to our channel, and click the bell to be notified when we post new videos. Also, share this movie with family and friends who might like this show. Thank you for following us to the end of this incredible story. See you in the next video. May God be with you always. Amen.